So now that we've adopted the security mindset, let's return to election systems and start thinking about what are the security requirements that a voting system needs to enforce in order to be considered secure. The first requirement that we usually think about is integrity. And one definition is that this simply means that the outcome of the election matches voter intent. Now, this might seem obvious, but if we unpack it, there turn out to be a few subtleties here. First, why are we saying outcome? Well, outcome, in other words, the winners of the election, is a slightly weaker requirement than we might ask. We might be asking that the counts should be exact. But it turns out that in real elections, if you're counting 1 million votes, it's almost impossible to guarantee 100% accuracy. There are always going to be some errors that aren't caught. So we're going to have a slightly weaker requirement and just say that the quote-unquote right candidate should be declared the winner. Then there's the notion of voter intent. Voter intent means that your vote is counted the way you intended it to be counted. This sounds obvious, but there are actually a lot of places where things can go wrong. The most famous recent example is probably from the 2000 presidential election in Florida, where the particular design of the ballot appears to have caused many, many voters to cast votes for a candidate that they didn't intend to vote for. Now, we'll see more about that in the next lecture, but it's just one example of where things can go wrong with voter intent. So another way to phrase this requirement is to break it down into two parts. A, that votes are cast as intended, and B, that votes are counted as cast. There's room for fraud or error in both places, and this is what election systems need to be engineered to avoid. Our next security requirement is ballot secrecy, also known as the secret ballot. And one weak form of stating this is that the election system should ensure that nobody can figure out how you voted. This protects your privacy against your snooping neighbors, your employer. It's a way of just as we intuitively think your vote should be private. But the real security mechanism that's built into our election requirements is a stronger form of this. It's not enough that nobody can figure out how you voted. We also ask that that should be true even if you want to or try to reveal to these other parties how you voted. Now, that's where the property gets really interesting. So why do we think about this strong form? Well, why shouldn't you be able to reveal to someone how you voted? Because if you were able to reveal how you voted, that would make it much easier for people to buy your vote, for you to sell it. Because then if someone agreed to pay you money to vote a certain way, they could know they were getting their fair bargain for it. If we have this property, then you can say you're going to vote for their candidate and still vote whichever way you really wanted to. The strong form of ballot secrecy also protects against coercion. A criminal might come up to you and tell you you have to vote a certain way and prove it to them, or else they're going to take some kind of revenge on you. And this form of ballot secrecy, the strong form, protects against that too, because even if someone threatens you, the system is not going to let you reveal how you voted to someone else. There's always going to be some doubt. Coercion historically was a major problem, even in elections in the U.S. And even today, you have to think about many different parties who might want to coerce voters into voting a certain way. Employers, unions, perhaps, even spouses or parents might want to have some say in how you vote. And coercion doesn't have to be a threat of physical violence. It could be something much softer than that, just that someone's going to think less of you if they find out you voted a certain way. And the weak form helps protect against that. But the strong form and the weak form together protect against even more violent or intimidating forms of coercion. Our next security requirement is voter authentication, which says A, that only authorized voters should be able to vote, and B, that voters should only be able to vote once, or whatever the legally permitted maximum number of times is. Who is eligible to vote is generally something set by the law, and as is how many times you vote. Fraud by voting multiple times was, in the United States, once a very common form of cheating. Today, because we have voter registration systems, this is something that's less prevalent, but this is part of the reason why voter registration was introduced. Our next security property is enfranchisement, and this means that all authorized voters should have the opportunity to vote. You might think about this as a corollary to authentication that we just talked about, because just as having people who are not authorized vote could be an attack on a voting system, discouraging people who are authorized to vote, who you think would vote a certain way, could be an equally powerful attack. Enfranchisement, the right to vote, is often a hard-earned civil right and is a core democratic value in many societies. The last security requirement I want to talk about is availability. And this means that the system is going to be able to accept votes on schedule during election day, and it's going to produce results in a timely manner. You can imagine attacks on availability as ones that are going to just stop the system from functioning successfully by, say, either having to turn people away on election day or causing excessive delay before a count can be announced. Often in computer security, we think about attacks on availability as things like denial of service attacks, where people try to overwhelm a web server by sending so much traffic to it. That has the effect of knocking the service offline and preventing it from being available to real users. Availability in election systems is in many ways even more of a difficult challenge to provide, because the date of the election is usually fixed. There's no provision in the law of many places to postpone the election day if none of the voting machines are working that day, or to run the election again if all of the voting machines mysteriously lose the information they're supposed to have counted. As I said before, security rarely comes for free, and often satisfying one of our security requirements makes satisfying some of the others all the more difficult. When this happens, we say that the requirements are in tension. And this is true for many of our requirements for voting security. It's part of what makes election security particularly difficult and interesting. Let me give you an example of a couple of the tensions now. One tension is between integrity and ballot secrecy. To see why these are in tension, I can give you a hypothetical example for a voting system that provides very, very high integrity. We're going to allow everyone to cast their vote, and we're going to write down their name next to who they voted for, and we're going to publish the whole list in the newspaper. So this hypothetical example would have very high integrity because you can verify that your vote appears on the list correctly, that none of the names on the list are people who are dead or who are not authorized to vote. Your neighbors can all do the same. It would be much harder to cheat. On the other hand, there would be no ballot secrecy, so it's much easier to coerce people into voting a certain way or to sell your votes. It's much easier to cheat. Different kind of trade-off. Another example of a tension is the tension between voter authentication and enfranchisement. In order to achieve a very high level of voter authentication security, we might ask that anyone who wants to vote provide a driver's license and a passport and a fingerprint, maybe produce their birth certificate. This would help ensure that no one who was not who they claimed to be could vote. On the other hand, it would have the effect of driving a lot of people who wanted to vote, who were authorized to vote, away because they didn't have the required documentation. On the other hand, if we wanted to ensure that it was very easy for everyone to vote, we might ask for no identification whatsoever, just for the voter to assert that they had the authority to vote. But that would make it very easy for people who weren't authorized to just go and falsely claim so. So once again, these requirements are in tension. Technology has the ability sometimes to influence where we can fall on these on these tug of wars, these trade-offs, or sometimes to even make the choice less stark, less of an either or, by letting us have some of each. But ultimately, these are not tensions we know how to completely resolve right now, and it's usually a decision for public policy where we want to be on the different spectrums of possibility. In addition to the security requirements we've just discussed, there are also a number of additional requirements that we consider to be very important for election systems. Sometimes these have security implications too, and we'll talk about them at various points throughout the course. One of these is cost effectiveness. We don't have unlimited resources to spend on our voting systems, so certain engineering trade-offs are going to be necessary. Another is accessibility. We want to make sure that voters who are physically disabled or blind or nearsighted or illiterate can all participate in the process. This is an important social value in many countries. Then there's convenience. If the system is just too much of a pain, many voters will stay home in places that don't have compulsory voting. Since we want to increase voter turnout in many societies, making sure that the system is convenient is very important. Then there's intelligibility, which says basically that if the system is too complicated for voters to understand how the count is being produced or why they should accept the outcome, then that's violating something that ought to be considered a very basic value, that the system should be designed such that all voters are able to understand why their votes counted. So the history of election technology has been a struggle to find ways to satisfy all of these various requirements at the same time. Because of the tensions between them, trade-offs are inevitable, and there's no one way to balance them all that's the right answer for all societies at all points in history. But over the past 2 centuries, people have invented a range of ingenious ways to try to provide many of these properties. Some fared better, some went disastrously wrong. And in the next lecture, we're going to see how these trade-offs have evolved over time as election systems developed from the earliest forms of voting into the digital world.